I believe it's best to get social athlete at an early age to instill expectations around training. And I think if you have a training partner who tends to be a social athlete, you've got to let them know consistently, this is what we're going to be doing in training. This is what we should expect. This is how we're going to feel. This is my plan. This is your plan. This is their plan. These are athletes that they can really slaughter training with high volume, but then as soon as they get sore or fatigued, they actually feel like the world's about to end and they're going to crash out. They might sit on a platform or sit in the corner of the gym and just stare, and they might be in tears. We're going to go into the number one thing that no one talks about in building strength, and we're going to start right now. Okay, so when we're building strength, there's three things that I like to focus on that fall under one big umbrella. And when we've trained athletes that have gone to the Olympics, gone to the NFL, gone to Power 5 football programs, wherever it might be, become All-Americans, I believe that there are three types of athletes from a psychological perspective. And I believe that when we can understand the three types of psychology or psychological types that we're dealing with, athletes, training partners, coaches, all of these areas will then in turn operate at a higher degree. And when we have these three types of athletes identified, we can then actually lay out better programming, and we can actually lay out better stimulus, and we can even go to the point where we can communicate better with one another. So if we're talking about an athlete, we're talking about a training partner, we're talking about a coach, and we are all on the same page of identifying what those three types of athletes are from a mental perspective, this will lead to greater gains long term. Okay, so when we're looking at greater gains long term, we have to create some type of sustainable process. Okay, and if we have a sustainable process that factors in not only the physiological aspect, so looking at somebody and saying, okay, are they fast twitch, are they slow twitch, are they tall, are they short, do they have long legs, do they have short legs, do they struggle with a specific technique, are they able to hit specific patterns, and what's their mobility like? These are all physiological aspects of the athlete and of the individual who's trying to gain strength. But we never really talk about how does the athlete take a specific cue? How does the athlete take stress over a long period of time mentally? How does the athlete handle stress in an acute situation in the gym? How does the athlete handle stress in an acute situation in a competition mentally? How does the athlete handle communication between one another with their training partners? And how does this impact their adaptation period over a long period of time, over a long sustained time frame? And we know, as we take a step back, we have a very clear understanding from the research world that there's a pretty substantial impact that things like words, prejudices, negative comments, things like this that you can say to somebody, when you communicate in a negative sense to an individual, there is a physiological reaction, okay, that ends up having a negative impact if you're saying a negative thing to another person, if you're degrading them, if you're putting them down, if you're beating them down mentally. You can see this simply in narcissistic research alone. You can see that the way a narcissist communicates with another individual in a manipulative manner can lead to these physiological struggles and, in turn, mental struggles over a long period of time. Now, on the other side, when we're looking at this from a positive light, we can even see in the research of just like a corporate business management, that when workers tend to be happier and when they're being treated in a more positive light and they're handling things in a more positive communication aspect, we can actually see workers tend to be happier. Workers have a ability to handle more stress. Workers end up being able to put out more consistent work that's at a higher degree. So we know, just using those two simple, super rudimentary examples, that communication and mental types of individuals can have an impact on adaptation. Okay, these types of communication and the ways that people handle stress has a very, very high degree on how they will end up performing in various sports. And so from a personal standpoint as a coach, what I've done since 2010 is try to figure out, okay, what types of athletes are there and how can we break these athletes down into 3 different umbrellas. And then when we break them down into 3 different umbrellas, yes, there's going to be subcategories, but for this video, we're just going to talk about those 3 initial umbrellas. And then how we can see them from an early standpoint when we're starting to train athletes early. If you're a training partner, or if you have a training partner, you're going to be able to see how, some people will say, man, my training partner can handle so much more volume than me. And there's a reason behind this, okay? There's a reason outside of just the physiological aspect. Yes, physiologically, there's a huge impact on handling volume or intensity, but there's also a mental aspect that never gets talked about, never gets discussed, and we are constantly just trying to create this broad stroke training system without factoring in this reactive analysis that you can do of athletes, and that's what we term that here at Garage Strength. So the big factor here is that athletes react differently physically and psychologically. That's a huge important topic right there. And then we understand that physical tolerance, we don't discuss, or we rarely discuss, that mental tolerance. And then we don't go into how can each type of athlete on a regular basis, we don't actually comprehend how each type can handle volume, they can handle struggles, they can handle external struggles, and then what are their life themes? Okay, I think that's a huge important thing too, is that we need to look at what are the themes of an individual's life when they come to you? What are the themes of that individual's life as they progress through their training, so that we're able to then sustain their career as long as they want that career sustained in the realm of sports performance. And so that's the overarching thesis here, is that we've got to go into these 3 umbrellas. We've got to understand that the mental aspect has a huge important impact on progress in the gym. And then how can we identify each specific type of umbrella? And this is stuff that we've been experimenting with and laying out here at Garage Strength since 2013, 2014, as we've developed athletes to get through multiple different Olympic quads, as we've developed athletes to get through multiple different periods of their life to go to become state champions, NCAA All-Americans. And this is stuff that we build on the back end and that we've rooted our training system that we use inside of our strength training app, Peak Strength. So Peak Strength is our strength training app that we've developed here at Garage Strength and that we're implementing globally. You guys can head over to peakstrength.app, the Google Play Store or the Apple iOS Store. You can download Peak Strength today. You can get into it and start training to make that progress to those long-term goals, to be the best version of yourself. Now, let's start off with this. The first type of athlete, okay, and I like to number these. We have a type 1, a type 2, and a type 3, and then we take that type 1, okay? The type 1 athlete, in my opinion, is known as the Zen athlete. And so I think it's really important to understand that right off the bat, when an athlete walks in the door, or even in the case of myself, I had a training partner at an early age that I recognized. His name was John Rowe. So John, if you're watching, a shout out to you. I recognized very early on as my training partner that John was wired differently from me psychologically. He was very stoic. He was calm. He constantly showed up. Very rarely would really question things and go out of his way to disrupt things, but just constantly did the work over and over and over again, and ended up becoming a Division I thrower at a local university. Similar to me, we had a very similar path. And so as we went through this, and as I grew up with him, I recognized that I wasn't like John. I was not that Zen athlete. There was something different. And I started to notice some things in training that were a bit different. And so the big thing here right off the bat from a descriptive perspective is that a Zen athlete are typically going to be individuals who are focused and they're level-headed. They're moving towards these super long-term goals. Okay, so they have these goals in their mind. They're typically rubber of the road, just get moving and just continuously make progress. It doesn't matter if it's fast progress or slow progress. As long as they're making progress, they're willing to do the work productively. Okay, so that's a big factor. And then at an early age, Zen athletes tend to be very focused. They tend to be, I like to say this, when a Zen athlete comes into the gym here at Garage Strength at an early age, let's say 10, 11, 12 years old, you can tell pretty quickly that because they are so quiet, okay, they tend to take everything in, and they take instruction very, very well. They pay attention very well. They execute as well as possible, and they really don't even ask a lot of questions. They just do the work. And so typically you'll see a lot of Zen athletes might tend to be the oldest child in a family. They also might just tend to be very process oriented. They're very good at waking up on time. They're very good at laying out their clothes for work or for school. They're very good at packing their lunch. They're very good at doing their homework. They're very good at going through and doing what is expected of them with minimal friction. And so these individuals rarely will break down, at least outwardly. And from a mental perspective, they do tend to handle stress quite well. Okay. And so they have a consistent adaptation to all these different types of stimulus. And then over a long period of time, they also enjoy just doing boring training. They just want to do boring, same types of modality on a regular basis. They don't really like variance in their training. And the hard part with a Zen athlete is that usually they're only about 10% of the population. There's not a lot of these individuals. There's not a lot of these type 1 individuals out there. And that's another thing I wanted to go into, is that initially the athlete reactive analysis here was sparked by my experience training with Dr. B. Okay, so Dr. Anatoly Bondarchuk was my strength coach, or my throws coach, and he had told me when we were working together that there's really 3 types of athletes and probably a 4th, and this is how their reaction curve looks based off of stimulus. And over a long period of time, a type 1 athlete will just have this slow burn that's just consistently growing over a very long period of time. Very rarely will they drop down and come back up, drop down and come back up. It's just this consistent slow burn. And so as I got into training athletes, and as I thought back and reflected back on my own training growing up, this is when I really started to take note of my experience with my training partners, and I started to take note on that type 1 individual. And so I really started to recognize, 1, there is not a lot of type 1s, and 2, they have an uncanny ability to just stay focused on this long-term process and to just do work over and over and over and over again. And in turn, that leads and helps them to even become pretty strong competitors as well, because they're so focused on the process. They have these rituals that they follow, and they're able to get into a competitive environment and just execute almost like robots, to the point of like, this is how logic is working. This is what I've done in training. This is what I need to do in this competitive situation, and this is how I can continue to make progress. Now, the big factor here is that they can handle a very large amount of volume in training, especially as they've trained for 2 to 3 years. Okay, so I like to think about, if we have a high school football player, somebody that tends to be more of a Zen style is typically going to be the individual who's someone like a safety or somebody who is a quarterback. Okay, they're usually going to be Zen style athletes that are able to take in all the reads. They're able to take in that high pressure, high stress situation and just execute the way that they've prepared. Okay, and so as they go through those competitive environments and those competitive situations and scenarios, they're able to continuously make adjustments and continuously adapt and be good. And I think that that's like an important aspect here, is that they handle that increase in volume. They handle stress really well. And very rarely will they even break down physically, because they tend to be more prone to finding their own way to improve, meaning they'll go outside of training. They'll watch videos. They'll try to learn how to improve their mobility. They'll get into nutrition. They'll try to do all the right things that it takes to become an elite athlete. Now, one of those big factors then from a general volume tolerance there is that if we're looking at even the next aspect around exercise selection with these individuals, okay, so if we're talking about now taking the umbrella of Zen, looking at, we know that they can handle that general volume tolerance is going to be high. We've had some examples of what type of sport they might be or what position they might play. And then on top of this now, when we get to exercise selection, okay, we can see that foundational movements are going to be king. Okay, so foundational movements are going to be king for a very long period of time. There's barely going to be any need for accessories or variations to come into play when you first start training these athletes. These are kids that are willing to come in 3 to 4 days a week and do a bench, do a pull-up, do a back squat, do a single leg squat, do a clean, do a snatch, do a front squat. And that's all you really have to do for a year to a year and a half. You don't have to get cute with anything because they're willing to just handle that specific type of exercise selection. When new movements are taught, the coach is able to use this new movement for a very long period of time. That's another big benefit, is that you can sit there and say, this is how you execute a broad jump. And then in your plyometric planning for this specific athlete, you don't need to get cute with how you're planning out their plyometric work because they're so good at just consistently hitting those standard foundational exercises. And then finally, they could do the same movements, and this is just to hammer this home, they could do the same movements day after day after day and not even notice that other athletes around them are doing different patterns. Okay, so these are the individuals who can be really good at individual sports. Okay, they could thrive in the individual sports setting, and sometimes they might even struggle as leaders because they don't comprehend why certain other athletes operate the way they do. Now, one thing I wanted to bring up with John, my training partner, was that John was very good at doing his version of what I was doing in training. So when he and I trained together, he would always just do a little simpler version of those workouts. So if we were doing a hang power clean, John would just do a full clean. You know, if we were doing a pause back squat, John would just do a back squat. And he consistently would make these adjustments just off of what he wanted to do, dumbing it down a little bit because he liked it that way. He didn't want to do other things in training, but he still was able to handle also more volume in training. So as a training partner, I would try and sometimes do as much volume as him, and I would die. And that's because of the type of athlete that I am. Now, the other example here is that when we're looking at a Zen style athlete, the one negative aspect is that their performance is going to be pretty predictive. We're going to be able to predict what type of performance we see. They're not going to go outside of their performance capability too often. They're not going to perform below their performance capability too often. They're almost always going to be within the specific range that is expected because they are so consistent. Okay, so that can be a downfall in certain situations, but there's sometimes that they can surprise. And then the other thing is that these athletes will literally do the same 5 to 10 exercises all year. And then finally, they're very clear with goals when asked, and they're going to be quiet in the training session. But if you can ask and talk to a type 1, a Zen individual, now all of a sudden these communication factors start to open up. You start to see like they think about a lot of different stuff. They're just not externalizing their thoughts. They have their goals, they have their processes, they have their rituals, they have the way that they go about training, and they're going to do it that way. And they will tell you what that might be, but it's not going to be anything outrageous that they're going to go out of their way to explain to you. They know that they want to be good, and they're going to control all those things internally, and they're going to get that work done. Now, when a coach or a training partner is communicating with these athletes, we need to make sure that we recognize that communication is in line with their type, with their personality type. Okay, someone who is a Zen athlete doesn't need a big back slap. They don't need to be screamed at. They don't need a lot of these different external factors because they have that internal motivation innate. It's built into them. It's implanted. They know what they need to do from a motivational perspective. And even in a competitive situation, it can be beneficial. Let's say if you're dealing with a quarterback, instead of screaming at the quarterback and slapping them, providing the logical explanation for what may have happened, and then also saying, this is what needs to occur for us to become victorious in this specific situation. That's how they look at it. So we need to make sure that when we're communicating with these Zens, that it's logical. It's not outwardly outrageous. It's not crazy. It's literally to the point from a logical, processional perspective. That's absolutely paramount. Okay. Now, I think that what you will see is that most of these athletes are going to be inside individual sports, but also they'll play very specific positions in team sports. And then over a long period of time, as they develop in those team sports, it's important to start to pull them out a little bit of their shell so that they can communicate a little bit clearer with other individuals. One of our best team sport Zens was actually Nick Singleton, a kid who would just come in all the time. You would talk to him. You would try to pull things out of him. And, over 2, 3, 4 years, eventually he started to talk quite a bit, but you still have to look at, like, one, what's his upbringing? He's brought up to do his work consistently, and he's taught to execute as well as possible. And that's the other factor here, is that oftentimes upbringing has a huge impact on what type of athlete someone's going to become. If athletes grow up with very specific regimented protocols from their parents, typically you're going to see an athlete that sort of falls in line and just goes about and does their work and does what is expected of them. Now, that takes us into the second specific athlete, and this is going to be a social athlete. Okay, so oftentimes when we're dealing in a training situation with a social athlete, let's say you have a training partner, or maybe this is you yourself, these are athletes that are typically going to externalize a lot of their stress, okay? So they're going to end up pretty much telling coaches or their training partner everything that could possibly be wrong or good in their life. Okay, along those lines, when they're happy, it's going to be noticeable, very, very noticeable. When they're upset, it's also going to be very, very noticeable. They're living and expressing their emotions constantly. Okay, and so they're usually going to explain their daily existence, all of the events in their life that have led to that point in their day. They will walk through and explain, and that makes it very easy to read these individuals, because you can see if something negative or positive has happened. Okay, you can see what type of temperament or what type of occasion they're handling in that specific day. And then these are going to be the athletes that will tell you, again, they'll tell you everything. Somebody cuts them off as they're driving to the gym, they're going to tell you. Somebody said something negative about them, they're going to tell you. So they really, really allow negatives and positives to weigh on them in a negative or positive light. Okay. And I think that everything about them is that you have to listen and sympathize with their position. Okay. So we've got to lay out expectations as clearly as possible with these athletes, and in even our response base, the way that we respond to them has to be very precise. Okay, as coaches or as even training partners, the way that we're going to respond to these different athletes has to be that we personally minimize our own complaints, or we personally, as a training partner, try to really negate any type of negative action that may have occurred to ourselves, because the social athlete will also then take that on themselves as well. Further, they will allow other struggles to really impact them. And so really what it comes down to is that these athletes are typically they're typically only children. They're usually going to come from pretty privileged backgrounds. They make up about 25% of the population, and sometimes they struggle with high pressure situations. Now, one thing I did want to bring up too is that a lot of the social athletes may have had some emotional baggage imprinted on them early in situations of abuse, in situations of just actually, because we did mention the narcissist aspect earlier, dealing with situations like that, and it's not fair to them, and they haven't, they were put in a bad situation at an early age, possibly. So there's sort of like a couple different routes from my experience with type 2s with these social individuals, that they're either privileged or only children, or they've come from some type of background where they were exposed to some serious unfair treatment early on, and they were never really provided the skills or tools to handle that unfair situation. And so I think it's important that we recognize handling the social training partner or the social athlete with positivity and support and as much grace as possible. And so when we look at something in the lines of like, how much volume can these athletes handle? Okay, we've got to look at what's their general volume tolerance, and then say, okay, volume tolerance is usually going to be good for about 2 to 3 days maximum. So let's say that we have like a high volume period. Okay, they're going to be able to handle very, very high volumes, and they're going to want that. They're going to say that they want that. But then after about 2 to 3 days, they're going to be really sore, they're going to be fatigued, and they're going to tell you they're tired, they're fatigued. And you can go about explaining to them as much as you want that this is the training block, this is how things are going to go down, and it will not matter, because they are going to let you know that they're fatigued, they're tired. And this is why I believe typically a social athlete will do quite well with daily undulation or weekly undulating periodization. Okay, so from that big picture, it's important to do that. Now, in a team setting, these athletes, it's a little bit harder to diagnose where these athletes might be. Okay, some of them might be heavier set kids that got picked on at an early age, although I'm not type 2. Some of these kids might be in like a heavyweight wrestler. Some of them might tend to be more prone to being a type 2 athlete. So it's best to identify that early on. And when I think through the lens of a type 2 athlete who comes to the gym at a very early age, let's say 12, 13 years old, and it usually takes me about 6 months to decipher what type of athlete they truly are. But usually a type 2 athlete will typically be a middle child, typically, not always, but typically be a middle child. And they'll also explain to you, even a 12 or 13-year-old, as you're teaching them and as you're coaching them, if they can't execute the movement pattern really, really well, they will explain why. They'll tell you that something happened. They'll tell you that things are really hard, or this is I was taught a different way. That's why I can't do this. They'll come up with reasons for why they can't do it, instead of it just being, hey, it's okay. It's a new movement. Like, you're not going to be able to execute this perfectly. It's okay that you're not doing this. Okay, and that's where the means of communication with them is really, really important. And as a coach, something that I've learned is it's extraordinarily important to not escalate anything that they say to you, because they're trying to navigate themselves emotionally and get themselves into this situation a little bit better. And so I believe it's best to get a social athlete at an early age to instill expectations around training. And I think if you have a training partner who tends to be a social athlete, you've got to let them know consistently, this is what we're going to be doing in training. This is what we should expect. This is how we're going to feel. This is my plan. This is your plan. This is their plan. And these are athletes that they can really slaughter training with high volume, but then as soon as they get sore or fatigued, they actually feel like the world's about to end and they're going to crash out. They might sit on a platform or sit in the corner of the gym and just stare, and they might be in tears. This is consistent. And so I think when we're looking at the exercise selection aspect, is that now we're looking at exercise selection, and we have to understand that they really like exercise selection that leads to variations in a lot of different movements. They like different cues, and they also like minimal levels of accountability. Okay, so they want different movements. They want different cues a lot, and they want minimal levels of accountability because they don't want to have confines on them in the sense that they feel somebody might be controlling them. They sort of resist that quite a bit. Now, the movements and the ideas, the more that these movements or ideas change in training, the happier these athletes tend to be, which doesn't necessarily provide a stable or productive training environment. Now, the thing here is that these athletes tend to love movements that they're good at. Okay, so when you're leading into a big competition, if you're a coach or you have a training partner, if you can identify at an early point, these are the movements that these athletes are good at, these are the exercises that they like. When they do things that they're really good at, they have a higher degree of happiness. And if we can keep that rolling from a coach or a training partner perspective, then they're going to make better gains long term. And again, if we can go back to undulation and lowering volume, and they're doing movements that they enjoy, now they can continue to make progress based off of their own internal happiness as well. And so that's a really important aspect to understand from a coaching perspective and from a planning perspective, because things happen differently for these athletes compared to a Zen. So the social athlete has much more undulation. They have much more variation. They have a lot of different cues. We've got to be very selective with our communication. We don't want to be super, super logical with them because it can actually lead to some frustration. One thing I also wanted to bring up, and this might be a little bit of a trigger, is that these athletes love functional movements. They love functional movements. And I've seen this in every sport that I've ever worked with that has had a type 2 athlete, is that I think the issue becomes in a sport where you might have a more precise measurement, like let's say a vertical jump, a power clean, a bench press. There's very clear standards that progress can be related to. These individuals do not, and they view that progress as a judgment. They view the assessments as judgment. They judge themselves if they haven't made progress. They judge themselves if they're not as good as they want to be. They judge themselves negatively, and they think the world is judging them negatively based off of these assessments. So there's two things here. They like variation in exercise, and they also like to do these functional movements because there's not as much of a capability to hold a standard with functional movements. It's hard to load functional movements. It's hard to really see a transfer of functional movements over to sporting realms. So they really enjoy that aspect because they can sort of take a step back and to a point almost ignore the standard. Okay. And so they tend to really, really dig into more functional based work. So the throwers I've worked with, they love to do that functional, like different functional rotational movements. And some of them are great exercises. The weightlifters I've worked with, even still in their accessories, they want to do more functional work. The football players that are like that, and wrestlers, they still want to do very functional, specific type work that it's hard to gauge progress. And that's okay. And so as a coach or as a training partner, that's how we can establish the accessories a little bit differently. That's how we can establish the testing periods differently. What's up, guys? Our podcast and our channel are sponsored by our own strength training app, Peak Strength. The entire focus of Peak Strength is to provide you guys with the absolute best sports performance app that you could ever imagine. We build out the programs on the back end. We take in all of these different decisions that we learned here on site at Garage Strength so that we can then apply it to you so you can improve your training. So if you guys want to improve your overall sports performance, head over to peakstrength.app, the Google Play Store or the Apple iOS Store. Download Peak Strength. You'll get a free week of training, and then you can start getting on those gains, get those reps done so that you can become a champion. Now, let's get back to the video. Peace. But then most importantly, when we're communicating with these individuals, we have to recognize that they want daily contact. They want daily contact before training. They want contact during training. They want contact after training. They want a recap of their training session. They want individual focus so that it's on their precise needs, and they want this feedback, and they want to tell you what they think. Okay, they want to tell you how they feel. And we as coaches or as training partners have to be open to hearing it and to absorbing it and to mirroring what they're stating. And I think that's a really important factor, is that in my coaching experience with these athletes, I've had some really good social athletes. I've had one social athlete that made multiple world championships, and he would consistently want to tell me what he felt, how training was, and he'd always want my time, and then I would think he would want to hear what I would have to say, and he would just be telling me what he wants, and I would get mad and be like, do you want me to tell you anything or not? And we would lead to this like just butting heads, getting into arguments. And I learned over a really long period of time, if we just mirror what they state. So if they're like, this set felt like this, let's say this set felt like I was a little forward, then I would say, oh, you felt a little forward. Yeah, today's training felt like really sluggish. Oh, you felt as though you were a bit slow today. Like, you take what they're stating and you just restate it in a very slightly different manner. And it ends up being really productive because they just need to process, and they just need to go through that. And I think that's important. I actually think mirroring is a great skill to learn as a human being in relationships as well. But when you're dealing with a social athlete, it ends up being extraordinarily progressive in the relationship because it ends up providing some sense of stability that they need, because they like things to be changing constantly. Okay, so they want that individual attention, but they want to tell you what they think is happening. They want it beforehand. They want it in the middle. They want it afterwards. And to the point where I've even had, it can be interpreted through a selfish light, but I've had athletes that I've had athletes that'll come visit and train from other countries. They'll come to the gym and they'll train, and they might disrupt the training pattern a little bit. I might have to go watch them throw or lift at a different time than normal. And if that disrupts a type 2, a social individual's schedule, they don't care that this person came from another continent. They care that their schedule got disrupted. And we've just got to recognize that means we need to be ahead of the game and to challenge them early on and to say like, hey, this person here is going to be coming here from a different country or continent. This might happen, and we have to set them up. We have to preface everything with that, and that's okay. That means we're just as clear as possible with our communication. Now, they want to tell the coach or training partner what they think about training and what they would do as well. And this can lead to some issues with authority. I think ultimately we need, as a training partner or as a coach, to feel as though we're just their mentor. They're telling us what they want. They're telling us where they want to be in training. They're telling us how they would go about doing it. And then you build it out and you really think through the adjustments, and then you mirror them when you're presenting the plan. And I think that that's a really important aspect. Now, the last type of athlete that I really think is important here, and the social athlete typically I think is going to be around 25% of the population. Okay, so I think personally that's going to be about a quarter of the population is into that type 2 social point. Okay, now the third point, the third athlete, these are the energetic athletes. Okay, so they're referred to as the energetic athlete. These are the athletes that love intensity. Okay, they love training. They love commitment. They love success. Okay, they live for proving people wrong. They live for making people proud of them. They live for high energy. They live for loud music. They live for attention. Okay, they are the life of the room. They live for this. They live for that feeling of success. And they're usually to a point, yes, there's a continuum or a spectrum of these individuals, and some of them are going to be one type of energetics. Others will be another type of energetic, but they still fall under that energetic umbrella. They are usually larger than life individuals, okay? And oftentimes they're going to be the life of the party. Okay, like literally, they tend to have partying issues as they age and they get older. They can get in trouble more often. They're going to lose their temper a bit more frequently in training. A vast majority of people that are in the sports realm will fall into this category. It's going to be about 65% of the athletes that you work with are going to be these energetic type athletes. And they tend to compete pretty freaking well. They tend to get after it, and they really will compete very, very well. Now, with that being said, it's important to recognize that energetic athletes will have types under there. Okay, there's going to be versions of energetics as far as like high degree to low degree. But most of these individuals, they just love training. They love the feeling of success. They love the feeling of being strong, explosive, aggressive, and that attention that it can provide. The issue becomes when we're looking at general volume tolerance under this umbrella is that the volume tolerance is going to be very high. If we're looking at like putting these athletes on a high volume program, for 7 to 14 days, they're going to be able to handle very, very high amounts of training. 7 to 14 days. Okay, they're going to kill it. They will kill themselves in training. Like they will push themselves. I like to think about, John Meadows would always talk about stimulating a muscle, putting tension on that muscle, and then fatiguing that muscle. These type 3s, these energetics, will do that every single set. They'll go through it every single set. So this is going to be great for 7 to 14 days, but then what happens is they'll fall off very hard after about 2 weeks of training, and they're going to dig themselves a grave. And the problem becomes, if we don't change it as their training partner or as their coach, they're going to dig their grave, they're going to fall into their grave, they're going to cover themselves up with dirt, and they're going to still keep trying to train as hard as possible. They're going to keep pushing as much as they possibly can. And this is why it's important to plan pullbacks more so with the energetic type athlete. This is why it's important to lower intensity and to even focus on very specific deloads here, because these are the kids or the athletes that when they come in the door, they're just raring to go. And so if we just explain to them, this phase we might just do 2 sets instead of 5. Or we might do 3 sets instead of 5. Or instead of going for broke, we're just going to get to like 4 or 5 reps left in the tank. And I think that that's a really, really important aspect to be aware of as a coach. And so daily undulation doesn't really do much for these individuals. It's more so like every 3 to 4 weeks, just back off a little bit so that they have this built-in governor for them, and they can have that type of success. Okay, I think that's really, really important thing. Now, when we're looking at exercise selection, these are going to be the athletes that they love fundamental exercises and they love the main variations as well. I'm thinking about somebody like Jake Horse, who would love to do like a high hang snatch or a two box snatch. He would love these variations. Okay, and he would be screaming because you can then push to hit a PR in these main variations and in the main lifts. And if you have a football player or a wrestler, like they're going to like power cleans. They're going to rip power cleans. They love fundamental lifts because they can be judged. They have these tests. They want the assessments. They live for testing week. Okay, so they are the ones that bring the energy into the gym. They're the ones that like elevate everybody else. As soon as they start warming up, they're running their mouth, they're talking trash, they're ready to get after it. But the downfall is that when they collapse, the whole room knows they're collapsing. When they break down, they know the whole room knows they're breaking down. They might throw things. They might get really mad. They might start yelling at people because they struggle with handling their emotions. And I think that ends up being a real consistent vibe off of these individuals. So we've got to, as coaches or as training partners, be aware of this in our planning. And so if we look at even from the exercise selection, they get annoyed by technical variations. Like they don't want to do a muscle snatcher. They don't want to do like a very technical or functional style movement. Okay. They just think that stuff's stupid. They can do their technique work or their functional work on the football field or in this circle or out on the baseball field or wherever. They don't want to have any functional stuff, usually zero functional stuff in the weight room. They don't care about that. The other thing is they want movements that they can push, they can be aggressive, and that more people can relate to. The reason why they love main variations and fundamental movements is that more people can relate to a 10-yard shuttle. More people can relate to, or a 5-10-5 shuttle. More people can relate to a 10-yard or a 40-yard dash. More people can relate to a bench press, a back squat, a clean. And so the more that people can relate to it, that feedback that they then get, the energy, the cheering, the yelling, the maxing out and stuff like that, they love that aspect of fundamental lifts. That's why they don't really like the other aspect. Now, the thing here, when we look at communication consistencies, is if we compare these to the energetics to a type 1 to a Zen athlete doesn't really want much before competition. They just want to stay dialed in. They want to have their notes, their rituals, their focus. They go about this in a big processional manner. The individuals that tend to get into like a competitive situation that are energetics, they want to backslap. They want to sniff ammonia. They want super high intense screaming. They want to go out and just die on the competitive field. They want to go as hard as possible. And I think that that's a really important aspect that we have to be aware of, is like when we're training coaches or when we're training with our training partners, we have to treat the way that they're approaching a big lift differently based off of what type of person are they. And most people are going to be a little bit geared towards this energetic level. They're going to be a varying degree, but they're going to be more geared towards this, okay? Now, they're good communicators. They talk a lot. They're going to run their mouth. They're going to talk a lot of trash. They're going to be aggressive. They're going to want people to watch them, okay? In the training situation, they're going to want more attention. And as I stated, they're going to sniff ammonia. And also they want more loud music. And they may yell, but they might also break down and lose their mind if they miss a lift, or break down and lose their mind if things don't go their way in the competitive situation. They might also be the ones that are more likely in the sport, like weightlifting or powerlifting or throwing. They might be the ones that bomb out or foul out. Okay, but at the same time, if the pressure's on and they need to hit a huge, crazy movement or lift because the pressure is on, they can go outside of their normal trajectory when it comes down to hitting a big PR, because they have this innate ability to dig as deep as possible. Now, it's still a skill that they need to acquire and build up over a long period of time. And I think that as a coach or training partner, if we can clarify where we're at in training, clarify the expectations and the positions, we can then do a little bit better job of mitigating any crazy reaction that they might have that is negative. But it still comes back to the way that we communicate with all three of these athletes as coaches or training partners is going to have a big impact on how they perform. Okay, and we've got to be aware that the psychological impact can be very severe if it's perceived in a negative light, or if it is a negative connotation. And so when we understand the mental aspect of training and the communication side of training and the means and the mannerisms that individuals have based off the type of athlete that they are, now we can really start to set up more effective peaks and more effective points of growth. And when we don't factor in that aspect, we're literally missing half the equation. Like half of the equation is just thrown out the window. And that is such a worthless, horrible point to be in as a coach or as an athlete, because now we're not factoring in a major point that can lead to tremendous success. So it comes back to understanding that concept, understanding that thesis, and then recognizing the three umbrellas. Okay, and the three umbrellas of the athlete reactive analysis is going to be based off of the Zen athlete, the social athlete, the energetic athlete, and then we've got to be aware of how they react and how they adapt to stimulus over a 14-day, a 28-day, and then even looking at like a 6-month reaction timeline. Typically also looking at how does the individual interact with you on the first day. Okay, are they making excuses or telling you why they can't do a specific movement? They're probably a type 2. They're probably social. Are they quiet and they're learning this movement? They'll take everything that you have to say and bring it in. They're probably a type 1. Are they telling you how much they've done on this movement before and how their PR is 10 pounds higher than what's actually on the bar? If they're that person, they're probably a type 3. And so you can start to see pretty consistent mannerisms amongst the groups. And then that makes it a little bit easier to improve your communication as a coach and to ultimately get athletes to become the absolute best versions of themselves. And so I hope this understanding, I truly believe this is the 100% the one thing that no one talks about in strength and conditioning, because we're not paying attention to it, we're not understanding it, we're not recognizing it, and we're not developing it within our own training systems. And that's what we're doing here at Garage Strength. That's what we've done, even to a point with our programming inside of Peak Strength. If you guys want more training, head over to peakstrength.app, the Google Play Store or the Apple iOS Store. If you want more content like this, click on this card right here. Because remember, freaks, if you want to become a champion, you've always got to cultivate your power. Peace.